Hello again. Hi everyone. This is the Give Value to Nature MOOC for teachers. This is the 3.4 chapter, Biophysical Valuation of Ecosystems. Let's go. Well, I would like to start with a sentence that for me it's very beautiful and it's completely true. We only love what we know. But at the same time, I think it's also true that we can only manage what we measure. This is one of the strengths of ecosystem services. They can be measured, so at the same time, they can be managed. Thus, ecosystem services allow us to introduce nature as a criteria in decision-making process. So we can quantify ecosystem services from different points of view. For instance, in biophysical terms, when we measure, for instance, the changes promoted by nature in certain environmental variables. And those variables have an impact on humans. But it's also possible to develop a social valuation when we focus, for instance, on the social benefits, for example, in terms of employment generation or health improvement. It's also possible to carry out an economic valuation when we make an economic estimate of the benefits that we obtain from it. Remember, there are three kinds of ecosystem services evaluation: biophysical, social, and economic. Well, let's focus on the biophysical part. Remember that is the subject of this chapter. So we can ask ourselves, how can we make evaluation of ecosystem services in biophysical terms? Well, for instance, by making direct measurements. Measurements can be done in many ways. For example, now we have a wide range of technologies that can be successfully applied in this field. For instance, we have environmental sensing. Uh, if we are talking about environmental sensing, environmental sensors, they can be applied in drones. So drones can be also used in ecosystem services studies. For instance, drones can be used to obtain thermographic images. In this slide, you can see some images about one urban park, El Retiro in Madrid, and they show how this urban park regulates the microclimatic conditions in the surrounding area. So the surrounding streets have a milder temperature. This is an example of a regulation ecosystem services that can be studied and measured using ecological sensor, ecosystem, environmental sensors implemented in drones. However, we have to take into account that ecosystem services are very different. We have different types of ecosystem services, so we need to make good use of different types of methodologies, sources of information. For instance, in this case, we have an example of one methodology more related to cultural ecosystem services. In this case, we can use usage questionnaires or methods to understand people preferences. We have seen that we can measure some variables, biophysical variables related to ecosystem services using sensors, using drones, and we can measure these variables in the field. But at the same time, we can use these measures, or even we can take into account our knowledge about ecosystem functioning in order to generate biophysical models to calculate the flow of these ecosystem services. For instance, in this slide, we have an example of a biophysical model, in this case a water retention index, that is fully related to the flood prevention ecosystem service. So we have measures in the field, but we can also make good use of biophysical models to quantify ecosystem services in biophysical terms. We are talking about uh, ecosystem, ecosystem services in biophysical terms. We are talking about a framework, this ecosystem services framework that has been adopted by the main European agencies, also by the most important international agencies, United Nations, for instance, and in parallel with this increasing this increment in the interest in the framework, different packages, different software have appeared in recent years in order to quantify ecosystem services, not only in biophysical terms, but also in social and economic terms. Here is a table with some examples of software related to ecosystem services. The most widely used maybe are the two first: Invest, developed by Stanford University, and Aries, based on in artificial intelligence, that has been developed by the Basque Center for Climate Change. Both are open source and you can use them, for instance, in your classes. They are very good and I recommend you to use them. In order to quantify ecosystem services, in this case in biophysical terms, what we need is indicators. Um, these indicators are specific of each type of ecosystem service. So, well, in this part, we'll take a look at different types of ecosystem services. This is a review. And we are going to add some indicators that can be used to guide biophysical valuation. It should be noted that there is still no clear standardization of the best indicators to use. We have a standardized classification of ecosystem services, but we don't have a standardized classification of indicators for ecosystems. But we are okay. Let's go to see some example of indicators. Well, for instance, if we want to measure in biophysical terms the provisioning from cultivated plants, we can use units such as kilograms, tons per hectare, megawatt if we consider energy provision. This is in biophysical terms, but also we are including some examples of social indicators. For instance, in social terms, we can work considering the health and nutrition issues related to cultivated plants. Provisioning services from rare animals. For instance, we can use indicators as heads of livestock, lead tons per hectare, and in social terms, health and nutrition indicators. If we work with provisioning services related to medicinal species, we can use different indicators. For instance, the number of species with medicinal properties in biophysical terms, in this case, but also in social terms, we can use the improvement in human health. Now, some examples about regulation services. In this case, for instance, filtering waste. We can use indicators as pollution mitigation in percentage or the left area index. This is in biophysical terms. In social terms, the reduction in the number of hospital admissions, for instance. Other example of a regulation ecosystem service, pollination. We can use the increase in agriculture production, but also the population size of pollination as the biophysical indicator. Uh, Another example, nursery, other regulation service. You can use, for instance, the number of species or the population size, a biophysical indicator. We have seen some examples related to provisioning services, also examples related to regulation. But now this is the moment for the cultural one. For instance, for the ecosystem service active and immersive interactions, we can use many different biophysical, many different indicators. For instance, the number of hikers, the visitors in a natural park, the number of divers. As you can see, there are many possibilities. Another cultural service, culture and heritage. Well, we can use different indicators, number of stories, tales, legends, intangible heritage, and in social terms, we can work with identity. The possibilities are enormous, and well, this is only we have some examples of biophysical indicators, and well, this is only a smaller approach to biophysical evaluation. Thank you very much for your attention. Please go on with